Folks, where do I find record again?
Says you're recording now.
Niko.
I'm recording, Tatiana.
Okay. So let's go ahead and start our commercial experience sheep and goat farmer discussion group. We've had quite a break over the summer and now we're starting up again. And our regular format is to have a extension educator or a farmer talk about, do a short presentation on a particular topic that's been suggested. And today our topic, and then to follow that up with a discussion about that topic, and then a discussion about really anything that that farmers are finding important right now. So our speaker today is Niko Kochendoerfer. She's going to be talking about adapting older dairy facilities to a sheep operation. Niko and her partner Louis Fox have a flock of about 400 ewes and expanding that was in New York and they spent 3 years working at modifying and surviving in a old dairy facility, and they've now moved to Vermont, and I'm not sure if they're renovating an old dairy facility there or not. So Niko will get started. So let's go ahead and do it. And we've got recording going on. So Niko, it's your ball now.
All right. Well, thank you, Tatiana. And yeah, it's great to be back with this discussion group, and it's great to see you all. Just very briefly for you who don't know me, my name is Niko. I'm currently a postdoc in the animal science department at Cornell. And what I do there is I lead a grazing study with about 150 ewes on a 54-acre solar installation. And we're tracking the environmental impact from different various stocking densities. So that's my job at Cornell. And at home, as Tatiana said, together with Louis, we have 400 Katahdin ewes. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point. Can you all see? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and so we're going to talk today about retrofitting old dairy barn facilities. And in particular, I'd like to focus a little bit on managing animal flow during lambing. So as Tatiana said, Fox Farms was formerly located in Cortland, New York. And we just moved this summer to Leicester, Vermont. And in fact, we're back to an older dairy barn facility, right? So we're doing the same thing again, just a little bit different. We have 400 Katahdin ewes currently, and they're for meat production. And we also, or Louis does custom grazing or solar grazing on solar sites throughout New York and Vermont. And up until this breeding season, we always had a terminal sire, a Texel sire, for our market lamb production. This year, we're not going to do that. We would like to retain most of our ewe lambs from the 2020 lambing, because next year we want to be up to 600 ewes roundabout. And our lambing period usually is 6 weeks from February 15th to April 1st. Yeah, and this is just down here, the progression. We started with 70 ewes in 2018. And the lambing season that I'll be talking about was last year, 2020, where we lambed out 250 ewes in an old dairy barn facility. And if we're looking at this picture right here, this is actually the barn shed of that old tie stall facility, which is basically connected to the end of two different tie stall sections of this older barn. And that's our flock of ewes. Okay. So first off, just in general, obviously, if we're moving into an older dairy barn facility or any older facility, there's opportunities and challenges involved. Opportunities, it's very price effective, very cost effective. Most of the time, these facilities are rented for a very low price. That means that there's low barriers of entry for beginning farmers, but also for flock expansion. And it allows for proof of concept right before committing to depth. So you can test your system, test your concept before you actually invest in a newer facility. However, obviously there's not room for many changes. You're sort of stuck with that facility. And the system that you come up with has to work in that facility because the facility is the boundary, right? And you can't start from scratch. So this is one of our tie stall sections here. And before the sheep moved into this facility, the milk and vacuum lines were removed from the former cow dairy operation, as well were the water bowls and the gutter cleaner chain. So right here is the gutter, and there were cleaner chains in that gutter, and they were also removed. And so, yeah, we moved into this tie stall facility that formerly held or housed 100 dairy cows. It's about 12,000 square feet. That's not all usable space. That's like the entire space of that barn. Concrete floors. And we spent an estimate about $5,000 to retrofit or adapt that facility for our sheep operation. And we also did not have any heated or automated water system. That's kind of like, is it a challenge or is it an opportunity, right? It's a challenge from a labor perspective because you spend a lot of time watering. It's an opportunity because the time you spent watering, you spent looking at the animals in any given pen. So for me, that's a huge opportunity. I'm a big fan of manually watering, but that is definitely something that saved us a lot of money, right? So now let's look at the barn outline really quickly. We had a milk house that had the bulk tank still in it, but it also had access to hot water, warm water. And that was also the place where we kept our heat lamps for weak lambs, cold lambs, etc. Right next to that milk house, we house our bottle babies because there's access to hot water. And then in the old tie stall barn facility, in the old section, we had our jugs, right? So we had a row of 20 jugs right here that were enough for us this year. And then right next to that old, and I'll show you a picture in a second, right? Right next to that old tie stall barn, there's a newer addition, right? A newer tie stall barn facility. Behind that was a little storage unit or a feed room. And in front of that, that barn shed that you saw in the first picture with the big gate that led to the outside pen. And we actually permanently fenced in that outside pen. We had gates there and a permanent perimeter fence because we kept sheep out there pretty much all winter long. And that's the basic outline of that 12,000 square feet facility. Okay, so let's take a look at the insides a little bit. So since it is a tie stall barn for cows, right, it had a feed alley on both sides. So this is the former feed alley. And we needed to sort of secure that feed alley from the inside of the barn because we only housed sheep on the inside. So this is a little bit misleading. Usually there were no sheep right here in the feed alley, right? And we use pig paneling here to sort of fence off the inside of the pen from the feed alley. And then we installed these wooden feeders here, right? So it's basically plywood sheets. And when I say we, I should say Lewis. Plywood sheets, right? That sort of stood at the bottom here of that concrete socket, and were then fastened with rope right here to create sort of like a triangle in which we then fed the hay and the silage each winter, right? And they could reach the feed throughout this pig paneling, and that worked actually really well, and they held up really well with very minimal repairs every winter. I think we could have used those, I don't know, for another 7-8 years at least. Exactly, and that's how that looked like, both in the old and in the new tie stall barn facility. And those are the gates that we homemade, custom made for us, right? This is sort of the design, this is how they look like. One of these gates costs about $18 and takes about 20 minutes to set up, right? You need a saw and screws or nails. And they actually also are pretty sturdy, minimal repairs every spring or every fall. And we use them for jug panels or for mixing pen panels. So that's how that looks like. And here's a photo of our grain feeders. So for grain feeders, and I have a better picture later on, we use these, what are they called? They're called, what are those? Sorry?
Stanchions?
They're culverts cut in half.
Culverts, thank you, exactly. So they're culverts cut in half, and they sit on pretty high wooden sockets there to be elevated so that they can't like step in it, right? So also very cost effective and very sturdy. And that's how we're feeding our grain. And then, so this is the outside part of the barn right here, where all the ewes were kept prior to lambing. So they had access to the barn shed. This is the entry of the barn shed right here. They could go in there for shelter, right? If it was raining and snowing, they had access in there, but they were fed outside with these round bale feeders, and we were feeding at that point first cutting haylage or baleage, right? And the neat thing about this is that we basically confined them inside the barn shed while we were feeding. So they were confined inside, and then the bales were placed every day. And then they sort of spilled out when we were done, but we let them out when they were done, and they had access to their feed. And that worked exceedingly well as well. And then in spring, this had to be mucked out. So this was just basically a bedded pack outside. Okay, so now moving on to jugs. So the way we managed our lambing animal flow in the winter was that we would sort out 60 ewes with the biggest udders, or the ewes that were closest to lambing, and they were sorted out and then moved into this old high stall barn facility where we had our jugs placed. And they were basically fed here on this side, and they lived here on that side. And then when they were lambing, we had a very easy time to pluck the lambs and the ewes to put them inside into a jug, right? And we used these former beds of the Tysol barn facility for jugs. So pig paneling left and right with these homemade panels in the back, right? And then everyone had access to their hay feeders in the front here and a water bucket. And that worked very, very well. And we had, as I said, about 20 of them. So now we keep our singles in the jugs for about 12 hours, 24 if we can. And the twins remain in the jugs for at least 24 hours. And then when they leave the jugs, they get ear tagged, tail banded, the ewes, and then castrated, the rams. We don't paint them. And after they get moved out of the jug, they move into mixing pens. And those first fresh mixing pens, they're located right in front of the jugs. And they're actually quite small. So we start out from 5 ewes with their litters for maybe a day. Then the next day, we combine these two groups of 5 into 10, and then 20, 40, and 60 within 2 weeks, right? So this is like a first little smaller pen here. As I said, 5 and then 10. And the neat thing about this was as well that these panels are very, very easily to remove, right? They're awesome dividers. So when we wanted to combine a group, we just took out these panels that were combined, right? Or moved panels up, et cetera, et cetera. So once that first group of 60 had lambed, right, they were moved to the new part, the newer part of the Tysol barn facility, the second one, right? So then all these ewes and lambs were brought to this barn right here, where they then were kept in a bigger mixing group. And then the next 60 group of the next pregnant ewes moved into here, right? So it was like a constant circular flow throughout the barn. And this newer Tysol barn facility is also where we had our first creep feed area set up in the back here. Also homemade creep feed panels here, and with a grain feeder right here where the lambs had access to grain 24/7, just a regular creep feed area. And here the ewes were fed on that side with haylage and hay. Okay, yeah, and then so it goes from the older Tysol barn to the newer Tysol barn, and then into the shed, right? That's like sort of the third step that these ewes with those lambs undergo. And you can see here they're a little bit older. So they're maybe about 2, maybe 3, I don't know, 4 weeks old, who knows. But that's the time when they were in the barn shed then, right? And then after they stayed in the barn shed, the last group of 60 sort of like moved up, and these lambs moved outside again, because at that point, all the pregnant ewes were in the barn, and then it was time for the lambs to move outside, right? As I said, it was sort of like a circular flow of mixing pens. And yeah, just a note for the creep feed area, that increased with the size of the lambs, and the number of grain feeders increased with the size of the lambs. But in the creep feed area, we had our hay feeders, grain feeders, and minerals available at all time. And that's just another angle of that barn shed with the bigger creep area. So our sorting chute and foot baths. So because we grew significantly within a very short amount of time, we bought in animals from more flocks than technically would be recommended, right? We all know that buying animals from many different flocks has a lot of biosecurity risk, and because of that, we ended up having a little bit of a struggle with scald, and that's why we tried to foot bath them at least once a week throughout the winter to keep that in control and to have only very few animals that were lame. And that's a nice thing about these feed alleys. So you can sort of guide the flock into these feed alleys, right? So this is actually the side over here, and you can see the sheep waiting over here a little bit, just poking through. So they're kept right here, and then walk around the pen, and then walk through the foot bath, which is located right here, into the chute area, and then into the sorting gates, right? And here we have like a backstop gate, and in the front we have a two-way sorting gate that made it easy to sort out, for example, the next group of 60 sheep that was about to lamb. And the foot bath, our foot bath looks like this, and actually work quite well. They get used to that really, really quickly. Those panels are standing there like this because obviously they're smart, and they try to walk on the rims of the foot bath and don't get their feet wet, right? So to prevent that and to force them to go through, we put these panels up, and that's actually just a wooden frame with like plastic foil, right? That is a tarp basically, that kept the water in pretty much all winter. And yeah, and anytime before they go through the sorting chute right here, they have to go through the foot bath. So I guess our two main challenges were definitely health related, right? So number one, coccidiosis. So if you move animals constantly and like a circular movement throughout the barn, what you do is you always have your young lambs where the old lambs were, right? And the young lambs are very susceptible to coccidia. And the older lambs, they shed coccidia. And to prevent that infection from even happening, what we did is, as soon as the lambs came out of the jugs with their moms, we offered a Decox enriched mineral mix. So we feed this Cargill lamb and sheep mineral mix ad lib. So they have that available 24/7. And we mix that with a very high rate of Decox. So that gets a little expensive. We use about 1 bag of this per week, but it's definitely worth it. We had 0 coccidia the entire winter, and that definitely leads back to that. And then bad ventilation and pneumonia risk. So in an older barn facility like that, so like in our old section of the tie stall barn, ventilation is very, very bad, which is why we had our jugs there. And that allowed us to move out those animals out of that unventilated area as soon as possible within 1 week, right? So we actually also had very, very little pneumonia. And just to show you that, these old facilities can in fact work really, really well. We had 212 used lamb. We had a drop percentage of 165%. 14 stillborn, so that's a little high at 4%. And I lead that back to the Texel terminal sire, right? Because we had a lot of very, very big lambs. So I'm not too sad that we're not crossing with a Texel this year and that we have a Katahdin ram. So that was a little bit, higher. So life lamb percentage of 150. In total, we had 17 AR or artificially raised bottle babies. That's 5%. That's also a bit high, but I have to say I'm glad we did that because our pre-weaning loss was remarkably low at 1.5%, and that is because we pulled off animals or lambs that were not really getting enough milk from their dams early enough and made them bottle babies. And yeah, that's why we ended up with this very, very low pre-weaning loss, live lamb total loss. So from birth to weaning or then market sale, we had a little bit higher at 2.4%, right? But overall, it's a pretty good result for an old retrofitted dairy barn facility. And I think at that point, I'm gonna stop sharing and open for questions. And I can go back to pictures if you'd like me to.
Hi, Niko. It's Mary Rose.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So what would you have done differently now in retrospect, if anything?
That's a good question. I asked myself that today as well. It's hard because I never had to ask myself that question because we're moving, right? So now we're faced with a completely different question. I think what I would have done differently is to have better repaired panels, right? So we had a little bit of issues like with our panels. We didn't like spend a lot of time to repair our panels. So we had a couple of issues with like just broken equipment. And I think I would spend more time to actually fix that prior so that everything, you know, is just on point when lambing starts. And I would also try to, okay, so this is an issue that we had prior to lambing. We had a lot of prolapses, and that's because we fed a very clover-rich silage before lambing, and that is definitely a lesson that I learned this year, not feed clover or high endified or not endified, sorry, phytoestrogen high feed prior to lambing because you will end up with a lot of prolapses. So those two things, definitely. But in terms of animal flow, I think it went really exceedingly well.
Niko, there's a question in the chat box from Lindsay Smith. How long was each 60U lambing window and how did you handle breeding to achieve that?
So we didn't breed for that specifically. We didn't use teaser rams, we didn't use cedars, nothing. It was a complete natural breeding. And the way we handle that is, or the way we handle those 60 groups is that we virtually every week sorted out, we let them run through the chute and we touched their udders and we sorted out the ones that we perceived as the closest. And we counted out 60 of them and then filled up that part of the barn, right? And so we always got ahead of them. There were like accidents, right? So it happened that some lambed outside. But it happened way, way less than we would have expected, right? And if that happened, then we would just have to manually walk them inside the chute part, inside the jug part of the barn, which definitely wasn't like labor saving or anything. And it was quite a pain in the butt, but as I said, much, much less than we would have expected. So we just sorted them manually and selected the ones closest to lambing. Oh, and how long was each window? I would say about maybe in the beginning, 7 days, and then towards the end, more like 15 days, right? So in the beginning, they came all in one blob and then they took a break and then, yeah.
And then another question is from Mary Rose. What kind of wood did you use for your panels? Was it full dimensional lumber? So was it rough cut or was it finished or what?
Louis?
Yeah. Unmute, Louis.
It was they're like they're like thinner than 2x4s. They're like
1x4.
they're like they're 1x4s. I just got them at Lowe's and they were cheap and they make a really light panel. And like for normal use, they're fine to do like for jug panels and whatever. And we even use them for like sorting sheep and corralling sheep. Like if it's a group, if it's like a big group of sheep and they start pushing on them, they can break them pretty easy. They're not super sturdy, but for like most of what we use them for, they do a fine job. And they're about $20 or so to make on between the lumber and
Are
and
they
the
pine or hemlock, or do you have any idea?
I have no idea. I don't know. They're probably just I don't know, pine. They're pretty cheap. I mean, you got to like sort through the pile to get ones that are straight, so it's not a very high end lumber, but in the kind of what I think the next thing that we'll use, I mean, the next most common thing we use now for corral panels is just like cattle panels, and sometimes I'll cut them down so they're 3-4 feet high instead of 5 feet, but that's been pretty handy without spending a lot of money on purpose-built sheep panels.
Or sorting
Yes.
chutes that are
Sorting chutes
outrageously
if you want to
expensive.
cheap out on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Strapping or purlins or whatever.
And-
Yeah.
I have a question as far as, did you change the lighting in the barn at all, or would you change
No.
how you
Yeah.
approach the lighting in the future?
We actually bought these what are they called? They're like halogen like lights. What are they called?
They're LED lights. We bought some like LED light panels on Amazon
And
and
just
use
hung
them for
them.
the lambing jugs.
Yeah, hung them above the lambing jugs because I couldn't see anything and I was really frustrated. So we had to buy these lights.
It's a dark barn. It's a really dark barn, and like it not so bad at night actually, but in the daytime there's just no, like your eyes never adjust, and so like in the daytime it would just be a really dark, gloomy barn. So those helped a lot.
I believe it was like that when I was a dairy farm.
So
Yeah.
now for the foot bath, did you have trouble with it freezing during the winter, or with that many animals in the barn, did that keep the barn unfrozen?
Yeah, it kept unfrozen. And we use zinc sulfide for foot bathing, which comes in like a white granulated powder, and that just gets dissolved in water.
And what kind of, how did you approach ventilation? And was ventilation much of an issue in a low roof barn like that?
Yeah, very much. That's why we put our jugs there so that we could move our animals out of that area as fast as possible. Because in the year prior to that, we had our jugs, we kept our sheep stationary, right? So we had groups of lambs that were in that old, badly ventilated area for, I don't know, 2 months, and we ended up with wicked pneumonia issues and had a lot of, like, a chorus of coughing lambs. And this year, not so much.
Ventilation is probably the biggest issue of that barn. Ventilation was really tough. And also the outside pen, like by March, April, it just turned into a slop hole. So we fought a lot of foot issues from that. So that was another challenge with that.
It's true. Yeah.
And I did what you did with adapting a dairy barn to lambing, but it seems like I'm wondering what your dimensions are between stanchions. Most of the space between stanchions for us was too narrow to make the size of jug that seemed to work well for us.
I think ours were 4 feet exactly, because we're using those 8-foot panels and they'll do exactly 2 stalls, I think. And then the barn, the barn we're moving into that we're renting this year is like the majority of it is a coverall, like a bedded pack, but then there's going to be stalls for jugs, but they're a little narrower than 4 feet. And it's going to be, we got to figure it out because those panels aren't really going to line up well. And it's going to be a weird size jug. So we got to figure out what we're going to do with that. And I don't think we've done that yet.
You said too, it was a 6-week lambing window in total. Our ewes always lamb closer to that. I'm just wondering what led to the 6-week window.
That's because we breed our yearlings as
Okay.
late as possible.
Okay.
And the last 2 weeks were mainly yearlings. So we started them out, I think, 2 or 3 weeks later than everyone else.
How many rams did you use?
Last year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Yeah. And that was 3 Texels and 2 Katahdins. And the yearlings were only bred to the Katahdins and not to the Texels because they are not, they wouldn't have been big enough.
Mary Rose is asking, what kind of problems do you anticipate in extreme weather events? With an old-
Yeah, so we actually were that, oh, that's an excellent point. So that barn shed, we were very, very worried about that because you remember that, Tatiana, because the snow piled up on it, right? And we had a cracked binder and it was a very nerve-wracking time. So we moved the animals out of the barn shed for I think 3 days until we were able to clear off the roof.
It's yeah, partially caved in each winter we were there.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a little bit exaggerated, but it was definitely stressful.
Jeff also has some pictures of his,
Yes.
right? So Jeff, do you want to make it Niko so Jeff can possibly share his?
Yes, you can go ahead and share.
Okay. Oh, here we go. First off, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Jeff Van Arsdale, and we have our farm in Lowville, up in Lewis County near Watertown, New York. And our operation is drastically different than Niko's and Lewis. We have a maximum of around 20 to 25 dairy goats, and we're milking between 8 and 10 or 12 each year. We're in this is our 4th year of retail cheese production. We make feta and unsalted chev goat cheeses. This farm, the barn was set up for a maximum of 65 stanchions, the 3-foot stanchions, the size of what you should be looking at now. And in a couple cases, I took what were the old wooden cow stanchions, took some bolts out so that they could be closed down. And a goat can use this stanchion and feed at it while we're milking them. These are random pictures, so please, I'm sorry they're not in a specific order. I just grabbed them while we were doing chores about 3 hours ago. The next picture is another side of this, of one of the wooden stanchions. I put a wooden bar across so that I could take an old water bucket and use that as a feeding pail. They'll come in and they'll stand there and get milked and get their feed at the same time. This is looking down what is the alley. There was a gutter chain that was removed. This barn sat empty for about 10 years. So it had frost heave in the floor, and you can see some of the cracks from that. The goats stay between the stanchion, what were the stanchions on the left side and the right. In this section, I used plywood and 2x4s to make some pens that are both kidding pens come springtime and staging areas for them to go to the milking quote unquote parlor. I tried to get the pens to be roughly 40 square feet, 5x8 or 9x4, whatever I could fit within the area where the cows used to stand. And generally it's about 2.5 to 3 stanchions for the length of each of these pens that you see in this section right here. Please stop me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll just go on through these pictures and we can do questions at the end also. This is a section, this is the one end of the barn that didn't suffer too much from frost heave in the winter time. And I turned this section into loafing pens for the goats. Because the barn sat empty for so long, we abandoned any of the old copper piping and also the electric, and we ran new electric wire for lights in the sections that we wanted to use. And you can see the new blue PEX water line that's running down to here that I used to fill pails in this section of the barn. They'll loaf in this section of the barn throughout the year and winter. We're able to close the barn up pretty well so that they're not in drafts or any wet conditions, and they don't seem to mind the cold as long as they're dry and not in a breeze. Down here where this red door is, that's where the manure spreader is. I'm able to clean out the alley and the bedding areas into the gutter, and then use a wheelbarrow to take it down and empty it into the spreader that's down behind the red door at the end of the barn. The area with the panels on the right side, that used to be a heifer pen, and now it's just another loafing pen that goats can come and go from. Our goats are a crossbreed between Oberhasli and Toggenburg. You can see that in the colorings on them. And here, 2 goats are in the wooden stanchions that I retrofitted for goats. And we use what were the surge belly pails as our milk pails. The surge belly pails would hang on a strap underneath the cow, and we're able to milk 2 goats at a time off of 1 surge pail. And here's the other side of the 2 goats waiting for their supper. And then here's the view from the other end of the loafing section of the barn. I just took some old sections that I had and made some little cubby holes so that the younger goats, when they get introduced to the herd, they have a place to hide from the more dominant ones. And the younger goats will come into these little pens for some protection from the older goats while they're getting the hierarchy sorted out. Right now, we have 6 kids from this year, 6 female kids that'll get introduced to the herd sometime over the winter. Right now, they live in a separate part of the barn. And in that loafing pen, there was an old cow feeding trough, and I just mounted it at the correct height for the goats and put made a little step across the gutter so that they can reach and just get their feed out of this old cow feeder. I had to use some pieces of panel to keep them from stealing from each other. Sorry, was that a question or comment? And this is another view of the alley, and that's my wife Jan bringing one of the goats back from the milking stanchions down to the loafing pen. And then this is a view out the end of the barn. Luckily, we have this great big concrete pad so that they're not tracking any mud into the barn. Right here to the left, this green grass you see is what used to be the cow yard and is now the goat yard that can be I section it off with electric netting and give them a section of that during the summertime so that they're not to rotational graze them here. And then also across the road, you see the red shelter with a white roof. There's a 300-foot square of pasture across the road that I divide into lots that they rotational graze in the summertime. So we got this little comic show where we lead them across the road twice a day in the summertime when the weather's good and they can go out onto the real pasture. This little bit of a what you see here is actually it's a chicken coop mounted on a old trailer, and I use chickens and guinea hens for parasite control out here in the pasture. And also the chickens and guinea hens come into the barn and we'll pick through obviously the manure for parasites.
That's gross. I can't believe they let you do that with your milk.
Well, it's in a different section of the barn. And then here is we have a real quote unquote goat milking parlor with a cascade stanchions, and the goats come up here and they milk. We use the pail here, and my wife is able to stand in the gutter here and just adding 18 inches puts the udders at just the right height for her to be milking them, or you know, putting the machines on them to milk. And then this is a picture of some of the old calf pens, and I use them, or we use them in the springtime as our kid pens. What used to be one calf per pen, I'll put either 2 or 3 kids in these pens when we're bottle feeding them in the springtime. And they'll stay there until they get about 6 weeks or so is when we usually switch them over from bottles to pails and then separate the boys from the girls. And then we put them into other pens then, but these are just the old calf pens and they work fine for kid pens. And I think that's my last picture. Any questions?
I know Mary Rose said the same thing as me, is that she loves the use of the old Surge belly milkers. And I actually brought one here from California with me, and I used it as a punch bowl in my college days. Nowadays, I think I finally gave it to someone else, realizing that my punch bowl days were over.
Yeah, well, my father-in-law actually used them on the cows 15, 20 years ago. And we have what are the original pneumatic and magnetic pulsators that we use. So we're not using the electric pulsators that are more modern. We're just using the old pulsators with the old pails, and that's what we use to milk. And then we take the pail into the milk room, into the milk house, and that's where we put it through the strainer into pails. And we have what was an old chest freezer that we converted into a can cooler, and we put the milk into 4-gallon totes. Stainless steel totes. They go into the can cooler, and then from there we pasteurize and make cheese 3 times a week. So, and that's it.
Dave Bruner's asking, do you put the guineas and chickens in the same paddocks as the goats when you rotational graze?
I would if I could train the chickens and guinea to go there and stay there, but I'm not that successful.
And I would want to point out that when it comes to worm eggs, those worm eggs are actually too small for them to purposely consume
Oh,
larvae. But as you say, they're scratching that, scratching up that pellet, and so therefore exposing it to more sunlight, depending on the length of the grass. And then, you know, and then with the guineas, they can wander pretty far. So as far as working on your snails and slug population, they probably are a little helpful that way too.
Are you using the same vacuum pump they were using when they were milking cows there?
no, we have a small, just a small pump that could handle 2 of those pails, 2 cows or 4 goats. And it's something new that we bought. I think that's the only new thing we bought.
Lindsay Smith is asking, when do you wean the kids completely off of milk replacer or milk?
Usually about, let's see, between 8 and 10 weeks. And they go on to hay, and they start to get a little grain. And then when the grass is at least ankle high, they'll go on to a pasture, and they'll start eating grass then too.
What time of year do you kid?
We shoot for late March, early April. We're breeding right now with a 5-month gestation. That way we avoid what was the bitter cold up here in Lewis County.
I was wondering about that with you not having a high population of animals in that
Right.
barn.
Yeah, we don't have enough animals to
pretty
keep
cold.
the barn warm. So we wait and kid, we try to kid after the 0 temperatures for sure.
And that way too, you're not having you're feeding your milk primarily from bottles early on, but by the time you're feeding from buckets, you're not having the milk freeze in the bucket.
No,
Versus if you were doing January or something,
right.
a density of animals, you'd have more issues. Jeff, where do you market your cheese primarily?
Just just locally between Lewis and mostly St. Lawrence County, and a little bit over towards the high peaks, but mostly it's just local. And we're at the stage in life where we're not looking to expand. We just want to make effective use of the size of the herd and production that we have in place now.
Hi, this is Betsy. I wanted to mention we had a lot of sheep in an old dairy barn also, the kind where you sort of had to wear a hard hat because the ceiling was so low. But it worked pretty well. We didn't keep them inside very often, only would pen up lambs sometimes inside to feed. And we used the one alley side feed alley for us to go up and down. Also because there was a grain bin in the upstairs that was real handy to use to get the grain. And the other side we used as part of our handling system sometimes, like you were doing with your foot bath. Not always. And so part of it was a stanchion barn, and we took out the stanchions, but left the uprights in between, and we ran boards across the bottom, and then a board left about a 9-inch gap and put another board. And these were just tied on literally with rope. And that worked pretty good for them to eat through. Actually put a panel above it, a hog panel. And except the lambs were going in and out through there a lot, which we didn't really want them out in the hay. And so we actually drilled holes in the top and the bottom board and strung like yellow nylon rope up and down like blanket stitch all the way down the barn. And that was ridiculously simple and worked really well. They could eat through there. We could feed them from the outside, which is always a good thing with sheep. And we could push it back and feed them grain on the floor and then push the hay back up. So if you're creative, we did a lot of feeding like you did also, Niko, with the panels on a slant on the outside of the pens. That was real handy and fairly easy. We also rolled round bales down the middle of the alley and set them up in feeders and did all kinds of things, but it can work surprisingly well, again, with ventilation being the biggest challenge probably.
Yeah, and I think like for us, a main concern with those slanted feeders was waste. And this is definitely true that on the side, you know, where they eat, the manure builds up much higher than it will be in the middle of the pen. But it also kind of depends on how you feed, and if they're not fed ad lib with hay or silage, right? If you sort of limit feed them or feed them just enough, they will actually eat pretty much the entire ration and not waste as much as we, I guess, thought they would be. So I guess what I'm saying is we were able to manage waste to a certain extent.
Are there any more questions? If not, why don't we go ahead and stop recording and we can go ahead to